Hey guys, Teacher Daniel here. For today's video, pag-aaralan naman natin kung paano kunin yung tinatawag na number of possible outcomes in an experiment. Mahalaga kasi na malaman natin yung number of possible outcomes in an experiment kasi ginagamit to in computing the so-called probability. Now, there are lots of ways to determine the number of possible outcomes. First is the so-called systematic listing. So, from the example in our previous videos about basics of probabilities wherein we define experiment, outcome, sample space, tapos event. Let's say we have this kind of experiment, katulad ng dati, tossing two coins. So we could determine the number of possible outcomes or the number of outcomes in this experiment, tossing two coins, by systematic listing. And those are head-head, head-tail, tail-head, and tail-tail. O, hari-hari, hari-patay, patay-hari, tapos patay-patay. Yan. Kung sa layman pa natin, kung sa Karakrus pa, no? Sad to say, ang ginagamit nating example dito, 2 coins lang for simplicity. So, medyo kung tutusin, mas complicated pa yung listing natin kasi what if marami na yung number of outcomes natin in a certain experiment na ginagawa natin. So, hindi naman natin rigorous masyado kung ililista natin lahat. So, maybe, we can make use of the so-called tree diagram. Wherein, sa tree diagram, mas malinaw natin na ipapakita yung mga outcomes or yung tinatawag nating sample space. Meaning, lahat ng list ng possible outcomes for that experiment. So using our previous example, tossing two coins, we can create a diagram. If we want to toss two coins, pwede natin siyang i-separate into two events. Our first event is tossing our first coin, and on our second event, that is tossing our second coin. First event, tossing a coin. And then, sa second event, tossing another coin. Parang ganun, po. So, in our first event, if we toss a coin, ang pwedeng lumabas is head or tail. And on the second event, say for instance, head yung lumabas sa first event, pwede natin siyang partneran ng another head. Kunyari, ang lumabas sa second event is head. So, it is denoted by HH, meaning head, head. Or, kung ang lumabas naman sa second event is tail, so meaning, sa first event, sa first coin natin, head yung lumabas, tapos sa pangalawa, tail na, it will be denoted by head, tail, or HT. So, using the tree diagram, mas malinaw nating naipapakita kung ano yung mga possible outcomes, theoretically. Okay po? Or, kung halimbawa naman, sa first event natin ang lumabas, tail, at sa second event natin ang lumabas, head, so our outcome will be tail, head. And if on our first event, ang lumabas naman ay tail, tapos sa second event, tail na naman, so our possible outcome will be tail, tail. All in all, upon using the tree diagram, you can show, not only just count, but show all the possible outcomes for this experiment. And those are head, 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 tail, tail, head, and tail, tail. So all in all, ilang outcome meron tayo? Meron tayong 4 for this experiment. Ang kagandahan ni tree diagram compared sa systematic listing, si tree diagram kasi mas malinaw mong naipapakita yung mga talagang posibleng maging outcome ng experiment na yon. Another way to show, not only just to count the number of possible outcomes, but to show the actual possible outcomes is by means of table or by using table. So in our example, previous example, we have tossing 2 coins. We could arrange those possible outcomes in a table manner. We can actually organize the result. So in our first 2 columns, we can put there our first event, and then dito naman on this side, we can put our second event. So sa first event, we have 2 results. It's either head or tail. Dito naman sa second event natin, ganun din kasi we are just tossing 2 coins, diba? Sa second event, tossing a coin pa rin naman. So we can have a head or a tail. At ang gagawin na lang natin, ipapares-pares na lang natin sila. So, syempre, mauna muna dito sa my first event. So, if we have a head on our first event as an outcome, and then on the second event, we have another head, the outcome or sample outcome will be head, head. And of course, if we have a tail on the first event, and we have a head on the second event, that will correspond to tail, head. So, pinapartner-part na lang natin yan para mas madali, Or, kung sa first event, head, tapos sa second event, tail, that will be head, tail. And, if we have in the first event, tail, and on the second event, tail pa rin, so that will be tail, tail. Ang hindi lang maganda sa ganitong method, yung table method, kasi we are only limited to 2 events. Paano kasi pag halimbawa 3 event na, just like yung totoong Caracross na, let's say tossing 3 coins at a time, 1 at a time. So hindi naman natin masyadong magagamit si table in this manner. Efficient lang siya pagka limited tayo sa 2 event. We could actually draw as many outcomes as possible, and we could extend the table as far as possible. Depende kung ilang outcome meron in each event. The only problem is limited lang siya into 2 event. The last but not the least is by using the so-called the fundamental counting principle. Ito na yung lagi-laging ginagamit ng mga mathematician, at ito yung highlight talaga ng video natin today. So instead na gumamit tayo ng listing, imbes na gumamit pa tayo ng tree diagram, or gumamit pa tayo ng table, or sometimes hindi maiiwasan, meron tayong 3 event and we would like to count the number of possible outcomes, gagamit na tayo ng tinatawag na fundamental counting principle. In this case, still, we are in tossing 2 coins. Ang gagawin muna natin, we are going to separate first as to how many events are there for that experiment. So, in tossing 2 coins, meron tayong 2 event. Tossing our first coin and tossing our second coin. Ganun lang kasimple. So, our first event is, of course, tossing a coin, tossing our first coin. And on our second event is tossing the other coin or our second coin. That is kung ihahagis natin yung 2 coin 1 at a time, hindi sabay. O bakit natin kailangan ihagis uli yung coin natin ng isa-isa para makita natin kung ano yung possible result. Kasi pagka pinagsabay mo, mahihirapan tayong mag-determine ng number of possible outcomes. Lalo na kasi in this example, mahalaga sa atin yung arrangement nung bawat outcome on each event. Yan. So say for instance in our first event, tossing a coin, we have 2 outcomes that would be head or tail. The number of outcomes for this event alone, in our first event, tossing a coin, we have 2 outcomes. Now, on our second event, meron din tayong two outcomes. Again, head and tail, because our second event, in our second event has something to do with tossing a coin as well. So in this second event, we also have two outcomes, and according to the fundamental counting principle, all we have to do for us to determine the total number of outcome or total possible outcomes in an experiment, all we have to do is to multiply the number of outcome on the first event and the number of outcome on the second event. Teacher, paano halimbawa kung marami tayong event? Let's say we have 3 events. The same. If you have 3 set of events, bibilangin mo muna kung ilang outcomes meron in each event. And all we have to do now is to multiply the outcome in each event to get the total number of outcome or total possible outcomes. So, in this case, in this example alone, in each event we have 2 outcomes. That is 2 times 2, that is equivalent to 4. Which is tama, di ba? Kasi ang outcomes natin is head-head, head-tail, tail-head, and tail-tail. 4 lahat. Let us have some more examples. Let's say we want to toss a coin and roll a die. So our experiment has something to do with tossing a coin and rolling a die. Again, our first event is tossing a coin with 2 possible outcomes. That is head and tail, right? And on our second event, we are going to roll a die, wherein we have 6 possible outcomes. Kasi 'di ba yung die meron niyang mga numbers from 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. And to get the total possible outcomes, all we have to do is to multiply the number of outcomes in the first event and the number of outcome in the second event. At kung meron kang pang third event, fourth event, just count the number of outcomes in each of those events and then multiply them to get the total possible outcome. So here, 2 times 6 lang is 12. Ibig sabihin, in this experiment, tossing a coin and rolling a die, we have 12 possible outcomes. There are 12 elements in our sample space. Yun. So those are head tapos 1, head 2, head 3, head 4, head 5, and head 6. As well as tail 1, tail 2, tail 3, tail 4, tail 5, and tail 6. Now, baka magtanong kayo, hindi ba po pwedeng mauna yung number? Kunyari gawin natin 1H, 2H, 3H, 4H. In this example, sa tingin ko hindi. Kasi ang unang event natin, yung first event natin is tossing a coin. Tsaka yung second event natin is rolling a die. Not unless kung nagkabaliktad tong dalawang event na to. Meaning, inuna muna natin is mag-roll a die tapos bago tayo mag-toss a coin. Oo, pwedeng pwedeng mabaliktad tong mga possible outcomes. O yung arrangement nung what is this? Nung acronyms nung outcomes. Pero in this case, syempre, nauna naman yung tossing a coin bago rolling a die. So, our possible outcomes corresponds to these kinds of names or acronyms, H1, H2, H3, H4, and so on and so forth. Okay? Linaw po ba yun? This time, kayo naman. I want you to identify the number of possible outcomes using, of course, yung pinakamadali ng process, the fundamental counting principle. Hindi na tayo gagamit ng diagram, hindi na tayo magli-list, hindi na rin tayo magti-table. Instead, gagamit na tayo ng pinakamadaling paraan. That is the fundamental counting principle, wherein we take note, we multiply the outcomes in each event to get the total possible outcomes. So first is tossing a coin twice. Number 2 is rolling 2 die. Number 3, tossing a coin, rolling a die. Naibigay na to kanina. I hope masagutan nyo po ito. Number 4, this time, drawing a trio from a deck of cards. And whenever I say a deck of cards, understood na yon na we are pertaining to a standard deck. And number 5, of course, yung pinaka-popular, yung nakikita natin sa mga peryahan, yung rolling 3 colored cube or yung tinatawag nating color game.